Leader of the Opposition.
Acting Speaker. Yeah, good. I've just found something there. Thank you, Acting Speaker. I rise to speak on the 2023-24 appropriation bills as lead speaker for the opposition. And I do so by commencing with a vote of thanks. And that's thanks to the hard-working people of Western Australia and the great industries in which they work, to all the hard-working folk across our state who support themselves, support their families, support their communities and support our state. Your efforts have delivered a surplus of over $4 billion for both the state and federal governments. Your surplus, both of them. And your state and your nation should be very appreciative of what you have achieved. This state government has brought down 7 budgets, 7 opportunities to deliver for the people who deliver for them. If you were to take a snapshot of life in WA right now after 7 budgets, what does it reveal? A health system in crisis. Housing shortages so dire that all bar 2 regional centres have a rental vacancy rate of less than 1%. Social housing wait lists now years long, with 34,000 people waiting on homes. Lawlessness rife across the state, with some towns crippled by crime, coupled with a dysfunctional corrective service system. For the last year, Youth Corrective Services has been the source of much pain for the community, and this government is unwilling to reconsider its disastrous management of the Banksia Hill facility. Communities impacted by Cyclone Seroja are still waiting for support years on. Kimberley residents have been cut off for months by floods, and it took the drenching downpours of Tropical Cyclone Ali for the vulnerability of connectivity to communities in the Kimberley to be taken seriously. And we hope it is taken seriously. And my thoughts are with those hit by either of those events and hope that they get back on their feet as quickly as possible. And I thank all of those who have worked hard in the response. And on Wear Orange Wednesday, I take particular note of the State Emergency Service, the SES, and their members, and all of the great work that they do right across our state. Members, in this, our wealthy state, with billions of dollars in surplus, why do 116,000 kids live in food insecure homes? How can it be that in a state as wealthy as Western Australia, how can this government tolerate a situation such as this? If there's one single fact that should keep the government and its members awake at night, it is this, that those children are at risk of going hungry. Western Australia has a new class of working poor. People with reliable jobs, working hard to support their families, struggling to keep up. And what do we see from the government? Another $400 electricity credit across the board. And what else? An increase to household fees and charges. Power's gone up, water has gone up, the cost of having a car has gone up. The emergency service levy will rise by a whopping 5%. While this government gives with one hand, it takes with the other. Since coming to power in 2017, the McGowan Labor government has increased household fees and charges by $1,030 annually. That's $1,030 of additional cost to West Australians, including those struggling to make ends meet. What we saw last Thursday was a Premier hell-bent on branding himself as the owner of this $4.2 billion operating surplus. Only after I asked him a question in this place did he give any tribute to the hard-working people of this state. The thing, this government and this Premier, the Treasurer, has forgotten that this isn't really their surplus. This is public money. This belongs to the people of Western Australia, the hard-working public that have actually failed to see benefit from this budget. The opposition believes that a budget which fails to deliver for the people of Western Australia is a broken budget, and we believe Western Australia deserves more. This government has a habit of making promises it cannot and will not keep, and we believe Western Australia deserves better. What the budget papers reveal is that this government is preparing for a general operating surplus of $4.226 billion for 2022-23, an increase of $2.342 billion from the forecast at the mid-year review, due in large part to increasing royalties. On top of the royalties and the payroll tax boom, the Premier has had the gift of the former coalition's government's GST deal, which has benefited the state immensely. Even with this gift, he's failing to pay down debt and failing to provide a community dividend. Since 2017, the McGowan Labor government has announced surpluses totalling $18.491 billion. Over the forward estimates, the budget forecasts the government will receive an additional $11.063 billion. In total, this brings the government's predicted surpluses to over $29 billion since coming to power. And yet net debt at the end of the forward estimates increases to $35.9 billion, $4 billion over the $31.9 billion the McGowan government inherited in 2017. Given the importance of the resources sector, it is very concerning to see that, according to Fraser's Institute, Western Australia has fallen from the top position as most attractive jurisdiction for investment in resources. It may be a sign of growing concerns over the introduction of Federal Labor's Environmental Protection Agency and the calling in of previously approved projects, coupled with recent unforeseen changes to the petroleum resource rent tax. Industry investment in major gas fields is massive and long-lived. Uncertainty created by taxation changes midstream and the federal government's hand-fisted approach to gas pricing does nothing to encourage that investment going forward. It may be also that this state government's haphazard approach to its so-called streamlined WA is catching up with them. Far from being the success claimed by government, discussion with industry at all levels will reveal that confusion generated during the machinery of government changes, along with capacity lost from the departments such as Demers and Dewer, mean that there is a complete disconnect between the rhetoric and the system, which is plagued with time delays. July 1 sees the rushed commencement of the Aboriginal Cultural Heritage Act. Funding for the under-resourced LARCs will come too late to properly prepare them for their roles. I expect there will be impact on every industry, every sector, every region. Inevitably, there will be delays to approvals, there will be confusion. The lack of consideration over the timing of the Act and uncertainty over any effect belated investment will have in the supporting structures for the Aboriginal Cultural Heritage Bill is causing great concern across the board. LARCs and the prospectors, the explorers, miners, farmers, pastoralists, local governments and any other land user will be negotiating and navigating their way through uncharted waters with a rush process which no one can see will work immediately and will take a very long time to bed in. More time and more education is needed to allow for the introduction of the new regime and to avoid frustration for the custodians of cultural knowledge and those other land users. Needlessly rushing this bill through Parliament with no opportunity for thorough scrutiny and likewise rushing regulations was a needless and unnecessary risk taken by the government. In the face of this, perhaps it is the case that investing in Western Australia has become less attractive because the impact of this government's unreliable hand is becoming more obvious. It may be that the sector has grown wise to the fact that this government may make promises, but it does not always deliver. Last year's budget promised to deliver $9 billion of capital works, yet only $7.2 billion were actually delivered. This is a demonstrated inability of the government to deliver the program. Take, for example, some of its signature projects. Yesterday, much was made of the announcement of laying track on the Anchep line extension. In 2020, this project was forecast to cost $431 million. In last year's budget, this was costed at $607 million. And in the current budget, it's costed at $982,374,000. It's blown out by $375 million plus and gone from in a year and gone from a delivery date of late 2021 to an uncertainty that it may be delivered sometime next year. Similarly, the Bunbury Outer Ring Road, which was first projected to be $852 million, was in fact in last year's budget blown out to $1.252 billion and now sits at $1.352 billion, with the project scopes trimmed back substantially, so that instead of being a freeway, it will end up largely a suburban road after the introduction of roundabouts. and the trimming of the original flyovers that were expected to be included. The Albany Ring Road has blown out from $175 million to $215 million, a $40 million cost blowout. This government needs to come clean on exactly what these projects cost and when they will be delivered, with a full accounting of the expected costs. What we've seen under this government is an unwillingness to provide firm timelines for any project and an inability to meet whatever sketchy timeframes it announces with each and every project. Making promises and not delivering isn't exclusive to transport. The Women's and Babies Hospital has become the perennial budget announcement for this government. In 2020, the Premier said funding was locked in with $1.8 billion. And again, in 2021, he said it was locked in and a plan was released with an early design of the hospital. In 2022, the site was confirmed near St Charles Gardner Hospital. In May, the language was slightly amended and the money was only set aside. Now we are in 2023, when the shovels are meant to be on the ground, and we have a new plan and a new site, and shovels are not yet there and not yet started. Somehow, the funds allocated remain at that original 2020 level. Despite every other major capital project seeming to be hit with increasing costs and massive cost blowouts in some of those projects, there's no further funding being allocated to this project. West Australians are now thinking we'll believe it when we see it. It's just not good enough. When this Labor government came to power in 2017, their first order of business was to take a raiser to the health budget, and they've been playing catch-up ever since. The overall investment in regional health is a pittance compared to what's needed, and major projects like new hospital developments or even firm commitments towards much-needed facilities such as the Geraldton Radiation Oncology Unit are lacking. Before the 2017 election, the government promised to redevelop the Geraldton Hospital. It's an indictment for the community that for years now, Geraldton and the Midwest residents have been voicing their repeated concerns over this facility being at breaking point, only for their calls to be ignored. These residents have been given a car park so they can sit at the front and wait, waiting years for the McGowan Labor government to get its act together. Originally setting aside $73.3 million, the project has now blown out to a staggering $122.7 million. With the timeline for completion well and truly blown out and expressions of interest still being considered, the community has no reassurance as to when the works will be done. Prior to the budget being introduced on the 1st of May, the McGowan Labor government made an announcement of $511 million to build social housing, with no time frame for commencement of works or plan on how to actually get the job done. We believe this is yet another empty promise. The delivery of housing projects is too important for our state to get it wrong. The government's inability to deliver is pushing our housing market to a cliff from which it will fall. While the Premier orders commencements of public works and construction in every pocket of Perth, he diverts workforce and resources from private works and from housing, from young families, from businesses, from people aspiring to build. New housing approvals in this state are actually the lowest in the country. While approvals soared during the COVID building incentives, monthly approvals for private houses fell to 866 in January this year. In seasonally adjusted terms, the lowest since mid-2012. In fact, they've only been 5 months lower than this since 1990. And while they rose in February, the increase was just 2.4%. In June 2020, at a time of low building approvals, the Premier acknowledged that the housing sector was doing it tough and we are facing a housing crisis. Now his response is to tell people how lucky they are to live in a state with such a booming economy. With the plague of empty brick shells continuing to push people to their limits, balancing rent and a mortgage for years longer than intended, few new builds are being submitted or approved. And what does that mean? It means when this great chunk of houses which are currently under construction are finally completed, we'll have a dearth of private investment in new housing. We're heading for an even greater period of scarcity. And this state government is failing abysmally to plan for that. Now we see the government scanning the globe for workers to finish homes that remain unbuilt. On top of that, we face the problem of having no homes for those builders when they come. Not to mention, where we'll house the builders we need for the new diversified industries, which we hope Western Australia will potentially develop over the coming years. The worker shortage that we currently face has been looming since 2017, when the McGowan government took just weeks to tear up the existing the skilled migration list, and Western Australia has not recovered ever since. Then came the pandemic and restrictions on international and interstate travel imposed by the state and federal governments, which certainly exposed our reliance upon international workforces in health, police, hospitality, agriculture, construction, transport, our reliance across the board. Regional businesses are being forced to shut their doors because of this. Government's failure to address this worker shortage is impacting communities. A shortage which has wound its way across the state and has contributed immeasurably to the challenges being faced daily in those communities. In many regional communities, housing shortages also play into this. Rising operating costs are now the #1 concern for all businesses. Amongst these factors are higher labour costs, which, as they rise, result in a greater contribution to payroll tax. One way to assist would be to reform the payroll tax system. The Premier has largely ignored the opportunity, instead opting to provide tax relief to the big end of town while taking for granted small and medium-sized businesses. Workforce challenges face the public sector just as they do the private. Perhaps two are the most obvious, being in health and the police workforce. And again, it's even harder to find staff the further you go from the centre of Perth. A shortage of health service workers is putting at risk many regional health services. Pregnant women in Carnarvon are being left with no choice but to travel for almost 5 hours or 1,000 kilometres to Perth to receive planned birthing services. Wyndham Hospital remains at a limited operating capacity, with overnight services having no choice but to resort to an on-call basis. The health system is more dysfunctional than it was pre-pandemic. These are the words of a former hard-working midwife who was left with no choice but to leave the profession due to chronic shortages. As we noted, this shortage doesn't end with the health sector. Our state's also short on police. At the current rate of resignations, we're reverting to 2015 numbers, despite the government's pronouncements around bolstering the police force. Meanwhile, communities, especially in the north of our state, are being ravaged by lawlessness and crime. Police are leaving in droves under the McGowan government, resulting in less police on the beat and a shrinking force. Resources directed to Operational Regional Shield leaves already stretched police forces in the city potentially exposed. Police Union President Mick Kelty said we can't have additional numbers of our officers up in the Kimberley forever, because that creates vacancies down here in the metropolitan area, and police have lost 372 officers since the start of the year. These workforce shortages will obviously have an impact on crime. On the back of record levels of crime is also the level of its severity, which has been worsening year on year. Under the McGowan government, violent crime has increased by 17% over the level that existed when Labor came to office. Meanwhile, family violence is 34% above the 5-year average. Over the last decade, four of the West Australian Police Force's 7 regional districts also experienced increased severity of crime. The Pilbara increased by 31.2%, the Goldfields Esperance region by 35.5%, the Midwest Gascoyne by 45.1%, and the Kimberley by a whopping 96%. An increase of crime by 96% is an out-of-control crisis. This government refused to listen to calls from the opposition for years on the severity of crime in some regional communities. They can't continue to hide behind empty partisan rhetoric. This worsening situation is put on their radar, and they fail to protect the communities and the families at risk. Late last year, distressing reports of police being threatened and assaulted in regional areas like the Kimberley made media headlines, raising questions about the efficacy of the supports like Operational Regional Shield in supporting those communities. We now see Operation Regional Shield will be delivered through using royalties regions. How maintaining key government services like police is a specialised developmental investment as intended under royalties for regions is beyond comprehension. But the dilution of royalties for regions is in Labor's DNA. This promise that the government has made to the people of Western Australia that it will keep them safe has delivered nothing. Despite the recent failures to manage Banksia Hill, culminating last week in a riot with a $30 million damage bill, the state's promised Kimberley Juvenile Justice Strategy, which included the non-country facility, is still not complete. Do you know why? I guess because it's out of sight, out of mind. But it's not out of sight and out of mind now. Banksia Hill has made it very apparent that it is needed. This budget has proven that the government likes to use the regions for political gain, but when it comes to delivery, they're nowhere to be seen. They're for their photo op, not for the follow-up for the long haul. Communities hit by Cyclone Seroja were promised a recovery that has not been delivered. 2 years on, the promised workers' accommodation, which would help enable the town's economy to continue to recover, has not been delivered. Communities right across those devastated in the Midwest by Cyclone Seroja have learnt to live amongst the wreckage and to take charge of their own rebuild. Most of the promised government assistance seems to have evaporated. If you live outside of Perth, this government will fail you. Labor governments have a track record of attacking regional communities. Just look at their successful quick removal of regional voices from the Legislative Council and the proposal to take yet another seat out of the bush in the Legislative Assembly. Look too at their neglectful decisions to shut down the native forest industry without warning, without consultation, or their silence at standing up to Canberra on the phase-out of live sheep export, the mess they're making at the end of the coal for electricity production in Collie, and the hit they've placed on coastal communities where their decisions around fishing restrictions and marine parks. As an example, the Labor government continues to play games with West Australian fisheries and marine industries, a staple of our state's vast and diverse coastline. Recfish West have warned the recreational fishing community and industry need to be involved in the $10 million commercial scalefish support package. And they believe that the $110 million charter fish sector has been neglected in this package. There's been great concern among the 50 or so businesses up and down the coast that will be affected. One of my constituents will see their charter business cut by 80%, and they will not be able to continue. This government boasts their support for aquaculture, yet failed to adequately manage the Geraldton finfish nursery process, having wasted taxpayers' money. They lost a local business that had been involved in the industry for years and had built up immense intellectual knowledge of the industry, was neglected in favour of an interstate company. And now we see that business has departed, and we see the $10 million wiped from the budget before the ink has even been dry. Another empty promise. They continually undermine legitimate industries which underpin jobs and communities. Who will forget their attempt to nationalise part of the rock lobster industry? Another unifying moment for regional Western Australia, which came together to fight this particular attempt by the McGowan government. The government's announcement of $22.2 million for electronic tags for the estimated 2.2 million sheep in Western Australia flock has been met with mixed support. It begs the question, what flock will remain as the McGowan Labor government stands aside and lets the Albanese Labor government decimate Western Australia's live sheep export industry? Local sheep prices have plummeted in anticipation of Labor's ban. There is effectively no market for many of the sheep which are involved in the livestock export industry. The Premier claims to support the industry. The Premier claims to have conveyed his support to Federal Minister Murray Watt. This is the Premier who says that he claims that he secured the historic GS Steel deal, yet he cannot secure the future of one industry. It's either that the Premier does not support live export, or he doesn't care enough to stand up to his colleagues. But they spell the end of a thriving, productive $136 million industry, which has helped, in part, to deliver this surplus. Agriculture is one of Western Australia's key industries. the Nationals and Liberals remain committed to all sectors of agricultural industry and will work to ensure their future now and into the future, including discussions around the effect of climate change and associated policies. For all regional industries, good transport links are an essential element. This opposition acknowledges the great support of the former coalition government in Canberra for providing funding for important regional projects such as the Wheatbelt Secondary Freight Network and also the Agricultural Supply Chain Initiative, and strongly support projects such as this continuing. And the opposition will continue to liaise with the transport sector and the industries and communities it services as we develop our policies prior to the next election. For all West Australians, road safety is very important. And in this Road Safety Week, I note that sadly, last year, 175 West Australians lost their lives on our roads. 2/3 of those people were lost on regional roads. The opposition will be working with groups like the RAC to help to ensure road safety, especially on those risky roads such as the South Coast Highway, which has been the subject of calls from my colleague, the member for Roe, in recent times. We would like to see that prioritised. We'd also like to see the Road Trust Trauma Account money expended in full to further enable safer roads. The opposition believes that a strong economy is a diverse economy. Surely then, any fiscally responsible government would want to invest in regional growth. There is significant economic benefit in bolstering the services to regional centres by ensuring local availability of critical services for business and life more generally, such as health services, education, aged care, childcare, etc. In the last few years, we've seen a tendency of people to settle in regional areas such as Albany, which has a significant influx of people from Perth. If we're to maintain this flow of people from Perth, we must maintain and create amenity close to home. As an example, I know there are a number of conversations occurring across regional WA, in the mining sector and in regional communities generally about the need for provision of childcare, with some larger businesses trying to now provide childcare within their own facilities as there is no alternative. It makes sense for them to do so because increased childcare increases and diversifies the pool of applicants for any role and encourages an employee to live close to site as opposed to being a fly-in, fly-out worker. A better outcome for the business and the employee. This undeniable benefit that would come is the same as that could be brought to a community. We need to take the opportunity in Western Australia to ensure that we are focused on regionalising our services rather than centralising our services. It would be to the government's detriment and to those communities' detriment if the government fails to see the abundant opportunity in our regions. I welcome that the government has made a nod to industry diversification, and I have a release here from the government on Thursday last week on Budget Day, a $463 million boost to drive economic diversification in Western Australia. And I do welcome that the government has made that nod to industry diversification, even if I would say that it's a hodgepodge collection of announcements scattered across a number of portfolios. It is a start. Our state has a vast range of immense opportunities, many and most stemming from the wealth in our regions. As a measure of that, I only need to look at projects in a radius of about an hour from my office in Dongara, and I see the many exciting opportunities that present in that part of the Midwest. The opposition have and will be supportive of worthwhile investments and policy settings that help secure new and diverse opportunities ranging from downstream processing of critical minerals, developing the new fertiliser options with lower carbon footprint, hydrogen, a whole range of new technologies. There's a plethora of potential for our state, but there is a window of opportunity which we must seize. But as always, with that, we need to ensure that there is a government which is able to make promises and also deliver them. Land supply and housing, especially in regional areas, will be a key component to enabling new developments. It's essential that utility providers are able to provide service in a timely way, and they must devote sufficient resources to this task. As an example, the provision of power in regional Western Australia is often problematic. A couple of examples from my own electorate illustrate the fact that the unreliability of the power supply, but also of the connection time it takes for a business wishing to develop or expand. Power prices are crippling small business, but power connection times mean businesses cannot get off the ground. For example, a brewery in Jurien Bay waits 15 months for a power connection and fears losing everything that they have worked for. The delay means they may not meet their liquor licensing requirements and also the local government conditions, and could potentially be shut down. An agricultural support of manufacturing business in Gamelling has invested $2 million in a new building. They've waited 12 months for the power up to now, and will take another 3 months to actually get a quote. The parent company in Ballarat, which has 500 staff operating around the country, are staggered at the delays and cost of doing business in Western Australia. They refer to the WA tax and ask, are we really open for business? The McGowan Labor government made a nod to this, made a nod to diversification in recent announcements and into providing regional land supply and headworks, but as a drop in the ocean compared to potentially what may be needed. The opposition's Regional Headworks Investment Fund would see $1 billion spent over 10 years to unlock development and encourage land release in regional Western Australia. The high cost of connecting water, power and sewerage has put many in local government and private sector offside when it comes to developing commercial, industrial and residential land. The opposition's policy is a real and genuine investment. Lack of preparedness when it comes to natural disasters is an issue which is also plaguing regions. Calls to release the state risk report have fallen on deaf ears, and with no money in the budget for the implementation of the recommendations of that report. Western Australia is a natural disaster-prone environment and will increasingly become so with climate change impacts. We only need to look at severe tropical cyclone Seroja, the Kimberley floods, the animal biosecurity threats which are just offshore, and the 2022 bushfires to see that our capacity can often be stretched. Preparedness for natural disasters is not exclusively a government responsibility, which is why it's incumbent for the Premier to release this report to the public. If the community can be better prepared, they deserve the opportunity to be so. I would hate to see the government hiding away information which could protect lives and livelihoods from the impact of natural disaster. This budget is largely one of smoke and mirrors. It's full of empty promises and re-announcements of announcements. The McGowan Labor government gives with one hand while it takes with the other, and thinks that Western Australians are none the wiser. Much like it thinks people forget the missed opportunities and poor decisions it makes. For the last 6 years of this government, the West Australian Treasury has been gifted surplus after surplus, coming on the back of our strong royalties and the GST floor raised by the former coalition federal government, with little or no benefit being felt in the community. This budget is another mixed opportunity by the McGowan Labor government to show real support for community service organisations facing unprecedented demand for their essential services. Services doing the heavy lifting when it comes to supporting the most vulnerable in our community. I'd like to put on record the opposition support for the great work these groups do. If the government had to pick up the full range of tasks that they and the 600,000 volunteers undertake right across the state, there would be an immense cost, a huge hit on the budget and a huge gap in delivery. Volunteers WA estimate that $39 billion is contributed to the West Australian economy every year by those 600,000 volunteers. The opposition have called on the government to provide a $300 million support over the next 2 years to enable these West Australian not-for-profit organisations to cope with the surge in demand from families doing it tough, but they have failed to do so. Our government, led by the National Liberal opposition, would not make promises it could not keep. We believe a government should be held accountable for its commitments. We believe a government that is committed should be delivering on a timeline with measurable milestones established. Making a promise with no plan to deliver is a waste of my time and a waste of yours. What you will see from us leading into 2025 is honesty about timelines. The Premier waxes lyrical about the benefits of his surplus, but it's not his, it's Western Australia. And what does a West Australian $4.2 billion surplus look like? If you're in the Midwest, it means no reliable power. If you're in the Kimberley, it means very few doctors. For those in the southwest, it means chronic housing shortage. In the wheat belt, well, we know the statistics on road fatalities in the wheat belt. For families, astronomical wait lists for child health services. For youth, difficulty in attending a school where there is adequate teaching staff. For elderly, unsustainable housing, inaccessible healthcare and no capacity to age in the community that you helped to build. Premier's surplus may play well for a front page or at the National Cabinet table, but in a state as rich as ours, West Australians seem to have been forgotten. If you look beyond the steps of Parliament, the surplus means what? The government continues to announce and re-announce projects it will not deliver. It continues to make promises it cannot and will not keep. The opposition in government would deliver. As I said earlier, the job of opposition is to hold government to account. We believe this budget is full of smokes and mirrors. A budget which promises to fail. A budget which does not deliver for Western Australia. There are 116,000 children in food insecure homes, 34,000 people on housing waiting lists, countless regional families wondering if their industry has a future, nurses covering triple shifts, small business owners working through the night with no solution to the worker shortage in sight, community services stretched to their limit in every corner of the state. If you take a snapshot of our state, it does not appear to be one who has enjoyed the benefit of 6 years of surplus. It has had 6 years of labour.